What happens when one of the most private, guarded young men in the world sits across from one of the most seasoned interviewers on television, and the conversation stops being an interview and starts becoming something else entirely? What happens when the questions get too sharp, the room gets too tight, and the man being asked those questions decides he's done being polite about it? Because that is exactly what went down on Good Morning America. And if you were not watching live, you missed one of the most jaw-dropping moments this show has ever produced. We are talking about Prince Jackson, the eldest son of Michael Jackson, a man who has spent most of his life deliberately staying out of the spotlight, choosing his words carefully, moving through the world like someone who knows that everything he says will be dissected, replayed, and weaponized. He does not do many interviews. He does not give much access. So when he agreed to sit down on Good Morning America with Michael Strahan, the expectation was a smooth, controlled conversation. Promotional, respectful, safe. That is not what happened. Before we get into it, if you are new here, make sure you subscribe and drop a comment below, because I want to know what you think about what went down in that studio. Now let us get into this, because this story has layers. Prince Jackson walked onto that set carrying something with him. You could see it in the way he settled into his chair, the way he measured Michael Strahan before a single question had been asked. There was a composure about him that felt less like comfort and more like preparation. Like a man who had already decided exactly how far he was willing to go and had drawn a very clear line in his head about what would happen if someone tried to push him past it. Michael Strahan, for his part, opened the interview exactly the way you would expect: warm, easy, the kind of opener designed to make a guest drop their guard. He talked about Prince's work, his presence in the public space, the things he had been building quietly away from the cameras. And Prince responded in kind, measured and thoughtful, the kind of answers that told you he had done this enough times to know how to keep the temperature in the room right where he wanted it. Strahan said, "You have done a really impressive job of carving out your own identity, and I think people respect that. But I want to ask you something, because I think our audience genuinely wants to understand you better. Growing up the way you did, with everything that came with that, how much of who you are today do you feel like is a reaction to your childhood versus something you built entirely on your own terms?" Prince let the question sit for a moment, not in a way that suggested discomfort, but in the way of someone who was deciding exactly which version of the truth they were prepared to share in this particular room. Then he said, "I think most people who had any kind of intense childhood spend their whole lives trying to figure out where the childhood ends and the person begins. I am not unique in that. What I will say is that I made a decision a long time ago to stop letting the narrative about my family define who I got to become. That was not easy, but it was necessary." Strahan nodded, and there was a moment there, a brief one, where it looked like he might let it settle. But he did not. He leaned forward slightly and said, "And that narrative has been enormous. I mean, we are talking about one of the most scrutinized families in the history of entertainment. Your father, obviously, was one of the greatest performers who ever lived. But the story around him, the controversies, the allegations, all of it, that weight does not just disappear because you want it to. How do you carry that? Because from the outside, it looks like you carry it almost alone." The room shifted. It was subtle, but it was there. The way Prince's jaw tightened just slightly, the way his hands, which had been resting loosely on his knees, became still in a way that was different from relaxed. He looked at Strahan with an expression that was not quite anger, not yet, but was something that had the unmistakable shape of anger waiting just behind it. He said, "I want to be careful here, because I think there is a difference between a question asked out of genuine curiosity, and a question that is designed to make me react a certain way on camera. And I think you are a smart enough man to know which one that was. Strahan did not flinch. That was the thing about him. Years in professional football, years behind that anchor desk, he had been in rooms with difficult people and difficult moments, and he knew how to hold his ground without escalating. He said, "I hear you, and I want to be straight with you, Prince. I am not here to ambush you, but I do think the audience, and honestly, I think you too, deserves a real conversation. Not a promotional one, a real one." Prince looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "All right, let's have a real one." And that was when everything changed. Because what Michael Strahan did not seem to fully anticipate was that Prince Jackson, the composed, careful, private son of the most famous man on earth, was not going to shrink when given permission to be honest. He was going to expand, and he had things to say that had clearly been sitting inside him for a very long time, waiting for exactly this kind of moment. Strahan shifted in his seat and said, "Then let me ask you something that I think sits at the center of a lot of what people wonder about you. There has always been this question, not meant disrespectfully, but about authenticity, about whether what the public sees from you is the real Prince Jackson, or a version that has been carefully constructed to protect yourself and your family. What would you say to that?" Prince's expression changed in a way that was hard to fully describe. It was not the look of someone who had been caught off guard. It was the look of someone who had been asked a question they had rehearsed the answer to in their own head 1,000 times, and were now deciding whether this was the moment to finally say it out loud. He said, "I would say that the idea that protecting yourself and being authentic are mutually exclusive is something that only gets asked of people who have had their lives turned inside out in public. Nobody asks a private citizen whether their public face is constructed. They just accept that people have boundaries, and that boundaries do not mean dishonesty. But the moment your last name is Jackson, suddenly every boundary is suspicious. Every piece of privacy is a cover-up. Every decision to not perform your grief or your trauma or your personal life for an audience becomes evidence that something is being hidden." Strahan said, "But you chose to come on this show," Prince said. "I did," Strahan said. "So you chose this audience," Prince said. "I chose this conversation. Those are not the same thing, and I think that is exactly what I am talking about. The assumption that because I showed up, I surrendered. That, because I agreed to sit in this chair, every part of me is now available. That is not how this works. That has never been how this works. But people have a hard time accepting that when it comes to me, because they feel like my life belongs to them in some way. It does not." The audience in the studio was quiet in a way that studios rarely get quiet. Strahan said, "I don't think anyone is saying your life belongs to them." And Prince Jackson looked at him, steady, direct, and said, "Then with respect, Michael, you have not been paying attention." That line landed in the studio like something physical, like a door being shut firmly but without a slam, the kind of closed that is somehow louder than noise. Michael Strahan, to his credit, did not try to immediately recover the moment or redirect the conversation somewhere safer. He sat with it, and that decision, to let the silence breathe rather than rush past it, was the thing that actually kept this interview from collapsing into something defensive and unproductive. Because what came next required space. It required both men to acknowledge that this conversation had moved somewhere neither of them had fully mapped out before they sat down. Strahan said, "All right, help me understand what you mean by that. Because I think that is a genuinely important thing you just said, and I do not want to gloss over it." Prince said, "What I mean is that there is an entire industry built around the idea that my family's pain is content. That the worst moments of our lives are entertainment. And that industry has been running since before I was old enough to understand what it was. I grew up watching people who had never met my father, never spent a single day in our home, sit on television and explain to the world who he was, what he did, what he felt, what he meant. And those people were treated as authorities. Their versions of him were packaged and sold and consumed. And we, the people who actually knew him, who actually loved him, were expected to either participate in that or stay quiet while it happened. Strahan said, "And you stayed quiet." Prince said, "For a long time, yes. Because I was taught that dignity meant not lowering yourself to every fight, that not every provocation deserved a response. And I still believe that. But there is a version of quiet that becomes complicity if you hold on to it too long. And I think there were moments where our silence got interpreted as admission, as though the absence of a rebuttal meant the accusations were true. And that is something I have had to sit with." Strahan nodded slowly. He said, "So you regret the silence?" Prince said, "I regret that the silence was used against us. Whether I regret making the choice, that is more complicated. Because the alternative was to be constantly in these kinds of chairs, constantly defending, constantly explaining, constantly performing our innocence for people who had already made up their minds. And that is its own kind of exhaustion. There was no clean option. There was never a clean option." It was the most personal thing he had said since sitting down, and you could feel the shift in the room again, different from before. Less like tension and more like something opening up, like a window in a room that had been sealed for too long. Strahan leaned back slightly and said, "I want to ask you something about your father, specifically, because I think everything we are talking about really lives in that space. You were a child when you lost him. You were 12 years old, and the entire world had an opinion about who he was and what his death meant. How does a 12-year-old process grief that is also a global news event?" Prince was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice had changed in texture. Not softer exactly, but more deliberate. Like each word was being chosen by hand. He said, "You do not. Not at 12. At 12, you're just trying to survive the day. You are trying to understand why there are cameras outside your house when you wake up in the morning. You are trying to understand why strangers are crying on your television for someone they never met, while you are sitting in your bedroom trying to figure out how to cry for the person you did know. The public grief and the private grief are completely different things, and they do not coexist easily. For a long time, they did not coexist at all." Strahan said. "When did they start to?" Prince said, "When I stopped trying to protect one from the other. When I accepted that both things could be true at the same time, that the world lost something enormous, and that I lost something that had nothing to do with entertainment or legacy or cultural impact. I lost my dad, and those two losses have very little to do with each other, even though the world wants to collapse them into one story." Strahan said, "Do you think the world ever let you just be a son who lost his father? Or was it always something bigger than that?" And right there, something in Prince's expression shifted. It was not grief, not exactly. It was something older than grief, something that had moved past the acute and settled into the chronic. The kind of feeling that does not spike anymore because it has been present for so long it has become part of the landscape. He said, "No, I do not think it ever did. And I made peace with that. But peace is not the same as acceptance. I can function inside that reality without agreeing that it is fair or right. The world decided very early on what my father's death meant to them, and by extension, what my grief was supposed to look like, supposed to sound like. And when my grief did not perform the way they expected, when I was not publicly broken in the way that would have satisfied a certain appetite, there were people who questioned whether I was even really grieving, whether I actually loved him, as though the only proof of love is public devastation. Strahan said, "That must have been incredibly isolating." Prince said, "It was." And I want to say something clearly here, because I think this is important. I am not telling this story looking for sympathy. I am not sitting in this chair to generate headlines about how hard my life has been. Because the truth is, I have had extraordinary privilege alongside extraordinary pain, and those two things both deserve to be said. But the reason I am talking about this is because I think there is something genuinely harmful about the way celebrity families are treated in this culture. The way children especially are treated. We never consented to the spotlight. We were born into it. And the assumption that we therefore owe the public access to our inner lives is one of the most quietly cruel things that this industry perpetuates. Strahan said, "I hear that, and I want to push on something you just said, because I think it gets to the heart of a tension that I think you are aware of sitting in this chair right now. You are critiquing the machine, but you are also inside the machine. You are on this show. You have a platform. You use it. So how do you reconcile those two things? Because from where I am sitting, it looks like a line that is very hard to walk." Prince looked at him, and for the first time since the interview began, something that was almost a smile crossed his face. Not warm exactly, but sharp. Recognizing. He said, "You think I do not know that? You think I did not sit with that exact contradiction before I agreed to come on this show? Of course I did. And here is the thing, Michael. The alternative is not participation on my terms. The alternative is the story getting told without me in the room. Because the machine does not stop running because I refuse to engage with it. The headlines still get written. The documentaries still get made. The podcasts still speculate. The only question is whether my voice is in any of it or not. And I decided that silence had cost me enough already." Strahan said, "So this is you choosing to fight." Prince said, "This is me choosing to exist on my own terms, inside a space that has never been designed with my interests in mind. I would not call it fighting. Fighting implies the other side is listening. This is more like, I am going to say what is true, clearly on the record, and what anyone does with that afterwards is outside my control." Strahan paused for a moment and then said something that nobody in that studio expected him to say. He said, "I want to ask you about the documentary." The temperature in the room did not just shift. It dropped, because everyone in that studio, everyone watching at home, knew exactly which documentary he meant. And everyone watching Prince Jackson's face in that moment knew that he knew too, and that he had been waiting for it. Not with dread, not exactly. With the quiet, contained energy of someone who had been carrying a loaded response to that question for a very long time, and had just been handed the opportunity to finally set it down. Prince said, "Which one?" And the way he said it, measured, almost patient, told you everything. He was not going to make this easy. He was not going to pretend he did not know what Strahan was referring to. He was going to make Strahan say the full thing out loud, in front of the cameras, in front of the audience. Because words matter. Specificity matters. And Prince Jackson had learned, in the hardest possible way, what happens when you let vague accusations go uncontested. Strahan said the title, and Prince said, "Okay, now we are actually talking." Those 4 words changed the entire atmosphere of that studio. Now we are actually talking. Because up until that moment, as raw and as honest as the conversation had already been, there was still a sense that Prince Jackson was managing the room, choosing what to reveal and what to keep back. But the moment Michael Strahan said that title out loud, something in Prince visibly settled into a different gear. Not louder, not more aggressive, more fixed. Like a man who had just decided he was done being diplomatic about something that had never deserved his diplomacy in the first place. Strahan said, "I ask because I think it is impossible to talk about your father's legacy without acknowledging that it exists and that it had an enormous impact." What did it feel like to watch something like that be released into the world? Prince said, "I will tell you exactly what it felt like. It felt like watching someone dig up a grave on live television and call it journalism." The conclusion had been written before a single frame was shot, and everything in between was constructed to support it. And what made it worse was watching people consume it as though it were truth, as though the fact that it was distributed on a major platform made it factual. It did not. But perception is its own kind of reality, and that reality did damage, Strahan said. There are people who would say the individuals involved told their stories and deserved to be heard. Prince said, "People deserve to be heard." I believe that. But being heard is not the same as being believed automatically, and the same scrutiny that should apply to any story was never applied to the inconsistencies and contradictions that were left out of that documentary. None of it made the final cut, because it did not serve the narrative. So do not talk to me about people deserving to be heard when the editing room decided whose truth was worth including and whose was not. Strahan said, "Your family challenged it legally, and those challenges did not succeed the way you hoped." Prince said, "No, and that was its own education." There was a part of me that still believed that if you could demonstrate something was provably wrong, the system would correct itself. What I learned is that truth and legality are not always the same conversation. And learning that while watching it happen to my family, that changes how you see everything. Strahan said, "Then let me give you something. Say directly whatever you feel the record needs to reflect. This is your moment." Prince was quiet for several seconds, long enough that the studio felt the weight of it. Then he said, "My father was a human being. That sounds simple, but I do not think it has ever been fully allowed to be true. He had flaws. He had fears. He made mistakes the way every person does, and he loved his children in a way that was real and private and had nothing to do with the things that got written about him. The version of him that exists in the public conversation is not the person I knew. It is a construction built from speculation and projection and lies told by people with financial interests in those lies being believed. The man I knew was gentle. The man I knew read to us. That man does not make headlines. So that man gets left out. And I am one of the only people left who can put him back in." The studio was completely silent. Strahan said quietly, "Thank you for saying that." Prince said, "Just make sure it stays in." And right there, the whole room understood what Prince Jackson had done. There was no raised voice, no stormed exit. What he had done was something harder and more precise. He had walked into a room designed to extract from him, and he had decided what got extracted. He had used the machine to say the thing the machine had spent years trying to bury, calmly, clearly, with the composure of someone who had been preparing for that moment for a very long time. That is what actually happened in that studio. And now I want to hear from you. Do you think Prince said what needed to be said? Or are there things you think he still would not touch? And did Strahan push hard enough? Or did he pull back when it mattered most? Drop your answer in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you are not subscribed yet, hit that button now, because we are not done bringing you stories like this one.